My name is John Cullen, and I want to tell you a story. It's a story about a scandal, broken relationships, gossip, rumors, money, corporate rivalry, and curling. It's the story of Broomgate, how a single broom, yes, a broom, turned friends into foes and almost killed the 500-year-old sport of curling.
It was a year I'd like to forget.
Broomgate, available now.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It was just another day. But that's only because every day in Gaza comes with horror and death.
Cheers of joy filling the streets outside of an Israeli hospital as 4 hostages taken in the October 7th Hamas attacks have been rescued from the Gaza Strip. But Palestinian authorities say the operation came at a great cost to civilians in Gaza. According to Gazan health authorities, at least 210 Palestinians were killed and another 400 injured in the operation, which saw Israeli strikes touch down in a central Gaza refugee camp.
4 Israeli hostages rescued. At least 200 Palestinians killed. You can, and I'm sure many of you will, make your own call about the calculations there. But either way, the 246th day of the latest chapter in a decades-old bloodbath was a day like so many others. If you've been watching this conflict, with all its rejected calls for a ceasefire, all its proposed hostage exchanges and withdrawals, all its criminal charges and safe zones that become unsafe, and all this senseless death, you might be asking how, after 8 months, has no path towards a ceasefire proved workable? And if nothing so far has been able to stop the bloodshed, will anything? How exactly does this all actually end? Does it ever? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Khaled Elgindy is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he also directs the Middle East Institute's program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. Hey, Khaled.
Hi, it's good to be with you.
Why don't we start with what happened this weekend? There was a quote-unquote rescue operation in Gaza. Can you tell us just briefly what happened?
Yeah, well, it would appear that the Israeli military carried out a fairly elaborate, sophisticated operation to rescue 4 hostages that were being held in a particular area, I believe in 3 different locations within a few hundred meters of each other. And in the process, there was intensive fighting with Palestinian militants from Hamas and other armed groups on the ground, as well as massive airstrikes on that same area, which is, of course, very densely populated. Mm-hmm. And in the process of rescuing these 4 Israelis, approximately 274 Palestinians were killed. We don't know the exact breakdown of how many were militants and how many were civilians, but generally civilians have made up roughly half or more of the casualties in any given moment. So there was an extraordinary cost in human terms to this operation.
How many hostages are there left now in Gaza, and do we know how many of them are alive?
Right. I mean, we have reports. We know that something like 130 or so that have remained since the hostage release back in November. We're told a few dozen, maybe 1 or 2 dozen, have died or been killed in the interim. We don't have an exact number. I've seen estimates vary between 25 to 35 or so who are presumed to be dead at this point. There have been a handful of rescue operations, usually able to extract 1 or 2 or 3, in this case 4. But for the most part, the only real significant release of hostages has come through diplomacy, which, the last time we saw a major hostage release was in November.
It's been 8 months since this began, and to your point, diplomacy has been the main way of releasing hostages. There have been a couple of deals, I think, to end the siege and release the hostages, including one that Israel proposed and the U.S. helped broker. What happened to those deals, and why have none of them managed to come to fruition?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a painstaking process in trying to get these ceasefire proposals agreed to by all sides. And generally, people had what everyone thought was a deal that could work and that had actually been put forward by Israeli negotiators and approved by the Israeli War Cabinet, including by Netanyahu himself.
Mm-hmm.
That's the theory. In theory, it should have worked. But the reality is that Netanyahu has preferred, for his own political and personal reasons, to continue the war as opposed to ending it through diplomacy. And so that's the bind that the Biden administration is in. The administration is sort of pretending that Hamas is the only holdup and that if only Hamas would accept, then we'd have a ceasefire deal. But the reality is that both Hamas and the Netanyahu leadership have really been holding out. And we know that Netanyahu needs the war to continue for his own political survival. And Hamas has been reluctant to sign on definitively to anything that the Israeli leadership isn't committed to upholding. So we're kind of in a stalemate as far as where things go. But it basically comes down to the Israeli leadership prefers to continue the war than to end it.
Maybe explain a little bit more about that for folks who haven't been following sort of the internal political mechanisms going on in Israel. I understand a member of the war cabinet resigned this weekend. As you mentioned, even if deals are on the table, Netanyahu has seemed to really push to keep this going. What's happening inside that cabinet?
Right. So Benny Gantz was a member of the war cabinet, and he's also Netanyahu's primary opposition, as political opposition, and a key rival who ultimately wants to replace him as prime minister. So his leaving the cabinet is significant, especially in that he highlighted Netanyahu's essentially his rejection of the ceasefire plan that's been on the table since President Biden's speech. So he really highlights, I think, his resignation highlights this basic contradiction where Netanyahu is not rejecting in words the ceasefire plan, but rejecting it in deed and in action on the ground. And so this is one of the reasons that Benny Gantz has resigned. I think he represents a significant portion of the Israeli public. Whether it's enough to unseat Netanyahu or bring down his government, I think is an entirely different question. For the moment, I don't see a mortal threat to the Netanyahu coalition. The polls suggest that Gantz and Netanyahu are pretty close. Gantz has just a slight lead, but he had a bigger lead a few weeks ago. And so he may have squandered what opportunity he had to unseat Netanyahu.
What else is in play in the region that might force a change in direction of this conflict? Can you kind of explain the external forces that may push this towards some kind of resolution?
Right. Well, I mean, the external forces right now are working in both directions. Egypt, of course, has a border with Gaza. It is one of the key mediators in this process. Mm-hmm. They have a direct stake in Gaza's stability and security. But they also have serious problems with the way Israel's conducted this war, especially more recently, the invasion of Rafah, which is right on the Egyptian border. Egypt has always feared that Israel's ultimate aim is to push some significant portion or maybe even all of the population of Gaza into Egypt. Rafah is where Palestinians in Gaza were told to flee to in order to be safe. And then, of course, the Israeli army ended up invading there as well. Mm-hmm. So Egypt has a problem with the situation on its border. It has a problem that they say could even threaten their peace treaty with Israel. that's one of the reasons why Egypt is pushing very hard for a ceasefire. On the other hand, the situation in the north with Lebanon is moving in the opposite direction. Hezbollah, of course, has fired rockets onto the northern area. Israel has attacked many targets in Lebanon, and there's a brewing escalation there that is so far has been relatively contained, but could easily widen at any moment. So it's still very, very precarious, and there's a lot of talk that the Israeli coalition, that Netanyahu and others in his war cabinet are, once they're finished in Gaza, would very much like to open up the northern front and take care of Hezbollah, which poses a threat from Lebanon. That, I think, would really destabilize the region, because now you're likely to bring Iran, which is Hezbollah's chief sponsor, into the equation. And we could end up with sort of all-out regional war. And that risk of regional war is what is driving the ceasefire efforts, along with the massive civilian toll that we're seeing in Gaza.
I know that hindsight is 20/20, but we wanted to talk to someone like yourself to get a sense of how this violence could end. And before I ask you to, try to put your finger on a way out, go back to the days after October 7th for a moment. And would you have imagined that the violence would carry on for this long? What did you see at that point? And were you expecting us to be somewhere around here 8 months later?
To be perfectly honest, no, I did not expect that we would still be here 8 months later, not only still, with this scale of death and destruction that is being inflicted on the people in Gaza, but with no end in sight.
Mm-hmm.
We've been on the verge of a ceasefire deal for many months, and nothing has changed. We have a stalemate, essentially. And that stalemate will continue until there's a shift in one or both parties' cost-benefit analysis. As long as the costs of what is happening are deemed acceptable or even beneficial, they're not going to change their calculus. So how does this end? I think it ends by not begging and pleading and putting out more plans and rhetoric, but there needs to be a shift in particularly the more powerful side's calculus. Israel needs this war to continue, Netanyahu, as we've said. So something needs to change his cost-benefit calculation that imposes a cost, some kind of consequence for continuing, because otherwise there is no incentive for him to stop, because stopping the war very well could mean the end of his political career. And of course, he's also facing jail. So only when I think the United States is prepared to say, look, there needs to be an or else. You put forward a ceasefire plan, and if the sides don't accept, then there are these consequences. And the United States, of course, is prepared to impose all kinds of costs on Hamas, but has been reluctant to impose any costs on Netanyahu. And that's why we are where we are.
The U.S. itself is in a fairly precarious political situation. I don't think it's unfair to say, given the election that's looming. Do you see the American political calculus from the Biden administration changing at any time before the election? And then might it change after the election, their approach to this conflict, depending on who wins?
Yeah, I mean, that question is becoming more and more salient every day as we get closer to November. I think the administration had hoped and expected that this war would have been wrapped up months ago, but it hasn't. And now it's affecting the re-election prospects for President Biden. Look, this election is not going to be decided on foreign policy, but there is as we see on campuses and other protests, there is a significant segment of what has been the Democratic Party constituency that is prepared to not vote for Joe Biden and is prepared to maybe even sit out the election based on this administration's unwavering support for Israel and the continuation of this war. So just yesterday, I saw estimates of about 100,000 or so people gathered in front of the White House to protest Biden's red line, which people will recall he sort of unilaterally caved after establishing Rafah as a red line. And it's quite possible that he will lose votes from progressives and from Arab American and American Muslims who did vote for Biden in 2020, but are not looking like enthusiastically about Biden this time around. So he could lose key swing states like Michigan that will cost him the election.
Mm-hmm.
If we're still at this war in the way this war is being conducted in November, then that will certainly, I think, very negatively affect Biden's chances. So the sooner he can wrap this up, the more damage control he can do to try to win back some of those voters that have been lost.
You mentioned the protests over the red line outside the White House. I think there has been, as this war has dragged on, a growing pushback against Israel's actions as they continue. Does public sentiment have a role to play? Is it making an impact? And could it? I mean, you mentioned Netanyahu's unpopularity in his own country doesn't seem to have done anything other than encourage him to keep the war going.
Yeah, I think public opinion matters a lot. It matters when you have an election coming up, but it also matters more broadly on this issue because it's one of the few foreign policy issues that really garner significant domestic investment. I would say there are constituencies who are very strongly pro-Israel, and there are constituencies that are very strongly pro-Palestinian. There had been a very pronounced power asymmetry between the two sides. I don't think it's a secret that the pro-Israel camp is quite powerful and influential in Congress and with the White House and in the media. But one place where we've seen a shift is in the narratives. The traditional Israeli talking points and narratives, I think, have been lost. I think large segments of the public have been put off by the images on their social media and on cable news, the reports of the horrific violence against civilians, the starvation. I would add a deliberate policy of starvation on the part of Israel. You have now a famine. People saying, this is the fastest case of starvation in recorded history. So I think a lot of people are put off by that and have a hard time squaring, Israel's claims to be defending itself with this massive civilian suffering. So there's a PR battle, I think, that Israel is losing in large segments of the country, and particularly, I think, among younger generations. The people who do not share the same narrative of Israel as the victim, but rather see Israel as the aggressor and sort of more honest about the power dynamics. In the David and Goliath scenario, Israel is clearly the Goliath here. It is far more powerful and far more capable of doing massive damage and destruction to Palestinians than vice versa. Even though obviously October 7th was quite a horrific attack in which hundreds of Israelis were killed. But it still doesn't compare to the kind of damage and destruction that Israel has wreaked on Gaza. And I think people see that for what it is.
You've already spoken to, the only way this ends is if some of the more powerful countries draw that red line that we've been talking about. If it does end, whenever it does, what is left in Gaza at this point in terms of infrastructure for there to be a meaningful life to return to the places in Gaza that have been decimated?
Yeah, this is exactly the point. And I think why so many people, so many analysts, including myself, but also others who have been arguing that whatever short-term tactical gains Israel might make against Hamas, the long-term damage done to Israel's security because of the instability that is being caused is, I think, immeasurable. You now have the majority of Gaza's population have been uprooted and displaced many, in some cases, multiple times. And most of Gaza's infrastructure has been destroyed. It's hard for Palestinians and others to not conclude that the goal of this war is ultimately to render Gaza uninhabitable. And so I think even if the war ends tomorrow, there is a huge risk that people will leave, if not immediately, then over the next several months and years, because there are no universities. Each and every single university has been destroyed. Most hospitals have been destroyed. Most schools have been destroyed. Most roads have been destroyed. Upwards of 70% of the homes have been destroyed or damaged. So how can people live in such a place? I think that's the question, and why people are kind of scratching their heads as to how can anyone allow this to continue? It cannot be any real gains at this point. And so there's a real risk of a kind of depopulation of Gaza by attrition. We might even call it, given the sentiments expressed by many in Israeli leadership, you might even call it a form of ethnic cleansing. Many Israeli leaders have not been shy about stating their preference for the population of Gaza to simply leave. And so that's a real risk. But then there are so many other risks, the long-term health, physical health effects of long-term starvation there will be effects on mental health for the development of children that will last for years and decades to come. The collective trauma that has been inflicted on an entire population will last, again, I think, decades. So we're really, getting a ceasefire, ending this horror is really just the first step. And I think the only real way to mitigate those long-term risks of destabilization are to have some form of accountability after the guns fall silent. There needs to be accountability, whether it's the International Court of Justice and the genocide case, or the International Criminal Court and the arrest warrants that have been requested for both Israeli and Hamas leaders. I think for people to move on, there needs to be some kind of accountability.
Given what we've seen so far, do you see that happening in any meaningful short-term time frame?
Well, I think the ICJ and the ICC interventions are sort of moving along their own timetable. I mean, they're separate tracks from either the military operations on the ground or the diplomatic process in parallel. So it's a kind of third and fourth track, and they're going to play themselves out. The ICJ genocide case is going to take probably years to adjudicate. So we're not going to see any immediate returns. But the ICC, the International Criminal Court, if we could see actual arrest warrants issued at any moment in the coming weeks or months. And I think it wouldn't necessarily impact the situation on the ground, but I think it would change the calculus of key actors, particularly in Europe, who claim to uphold a rights or a rules-based international order, and who have said that they are going to be bound by the rulings of the ICC. So it will be interesting to see if there are arrest warrants for the Israeli prime minister and defense minister, if they're going to be enforced by countries in Europe, for example. So it will change the dynamic, but not in the immediate term. I think in the medium and long term.
Khaled, thank you so much for this. I feel like I have a little bit more context now on what it's going to take.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Khaled Elgindy, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca to send us feedback on this episode, because I'm sure some of you would like to do that. You can email us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or call us and leave a voicemail, 416-935-5935. The Big Story's in all your favorite podcast players. It arrives every weekday morning at 4 a.m. Eastern Time, and you can get it on your smart speaker by asking it to play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.